I've always grown up, and probably the young people here too, maybe everyone, with these key dates in my head that are exciting, that I wasn't alive for. I wasn't alive for them. 1948, exciting, right? Stupendous. We have lectures on it. It's come up at Bible school lots of times. It's an exciting thing. And then 1967 comes along, and Christadelphians around the world went through a surge in baptisms. One brother back in Canada told me that he was upstairs and his mom heard the news on around the 6th day, and he was dancing, and she was dancing down the stairs in the kitchen, dancing, right? And he was upstairs thinking, what's going on with mom, right? It's exciting times, prophecy-wise. But what I didn't realize until recently is that there's something going on in Israel that started back in the 1800s and that has only come to full light since 1980, in the early 1980s. And not only that, I would say that in the last 20 years, there's something going on in Israel that the prophet spoke about that I've never been aware of. And I would actually go a bit further than that. And we're going to see this tonight. I would say there's things going on in the last 10 years in Israel that are unprecedented fulfillment of Bible prophecy. And I feel like they've been right under my nose and I've completely missed them. So brothers and sisters and young people, tonight, what we want to do is focus on this one particular element that the prophets spoke of frequently so long ago, 2,000, 3,000 years ago. And so we've titled tonight, The Wine of the Prophets, and we'll see why. Now this is a bottle of wine from Israel. I'm going to tell you that the divinity of this bottle is not in its flavor when we open it, decant it. The divinity of this bottle is actually, it's better for me bottled up and having it on a mantelpiece, because this, as we're going to see tonight, this bottle of wine and a few others that we have here are an amazing testimony to fulfilled and fulfilling Bible prophecy, a specific thing that the prophets spoke about, multiple prophets, Amos, Isaiah, Ezekiel, and others. We're going to see how amazing this is. And not only that, as we go through tonight, what I want to do is just see how exciting that bottle is in terms of showing us the nearness of Christ's return. Weird, right? How can a modern bottle of wine, which is what that is, I want you to imagine that you were maybe 10 years ago or so, and I've never been there, so you just have to imagine that. Imagine that you are just happen to be in the right place at the right time in some creek, some remote part of Israel. And if you were, you may have come across, this is a true story, you may have come across a seemingly random group of researchers. And those researchers, if you were in the land of Israel and they were there, you found they'd have backpacks on and they'd be crawling around on the ground up the creek looking for something. All right? Now, this is a group of researchers that were looking for something, and they looked everywhere in Israel. I mean everywhere. So they took the map of Israel, they divided up into transects or quadrants, and they searched every square. Valleys, mountains, and they were looking for something really, really special. They went everywhere. The group was led by Dr. Shivi Drori of Ariel University. And they looked in every possible nook and cranny in the ancient land on a quest with a special focus being on the mountains of Israel. But I'm not going to tell you what they were looking for. But I will tell you that they found 82 of them. So just park that in your mind. We'll find out what they were looking for later, right? To form the background to this, what we need to do is to go back to the prophet Ezekiel in his time. To understand those 82 things that the research scientists found, and to understand how this bottle of wine here is telling us that Jesus is near, we need to go to the prophet Ezekiel. When you come to the prophet Ezekiel, there's an extraordinary thing that happens in the chapters around which we read. It starts in chapter 35, but the bulk of it, his prophecy in this context, starts in chapter 36, verse 1. Let's read verse 1. And note how unusual this is. And you, son of man, prophesy to the mountains of Israel and say, O mountains of Israel, hear the word of Yahweh. Now that's extraordinary, right? Because most of the time, most of the prophets that we can think of are speaking to people, right? They occasionally speak to a city, but normally what they're doing is speaking to the people that are associated with that city or that country, like Nineveh or whatever it might be. But it seems that God asked Ezekiel to go out onto the plains or maybe even the foothills and stand up and speak to the whole bunch of the mountains of Israel. And he's not just speaking to the people on the mountains of Israel. He's speaking to the dirt. He's speaking to the valleys, the creeks, the little whatever, everything, the whole geography. He's actually speaking to the people, but also to the geography of Israel, to the mountains of Israel. And God says he wants those mountains, the dirt, the rocks, the ravines, to hear the word of Yahweh. It's crazy, and it's really different. So what does he say? Well, this is what he says in chapter 36 particularly. One of the things he tells the mountains is that they're going to shoot forth branches and yield their fruit to my people Israel. So he's not talking to the people, he's talking to the dirt, right? He says, you're going to be tilled and sown. And he says, I'm going to multiply people on you, the house of Israel. So again, he's not talking to the people, he's talking to the mountains and what would happen to them. He says, you're going to be inhabited like former times with man and animal, but it's going to be better. And he says, I'll make people walk on you. And the people that are going to walk on the mountains are going to be literal Israelites. That's who's going to be there. Now, as you go through Ezekiel, he has a lot to say about mountains, and we're going to skim through some of the key mountain prophecies, but we're going to zero in on the one that relates to our introduction tonight. So if you're not familiar, the mountains of Israel, I had to sort of do a bit of research on this because I've never been there, but the mountains of Israel are sort of this area here on the map, and it's a little bit exaggerated elevation-wise, but a lot of geographers will include Mount Carmel as part of the central mountain range as it kind of goes up the Jezreel Valley and over to Mount Carmel, so that's included. But also way up around Galilee, there's mountainous areas, as we know today. They're called Upper Galilee and the Golan Heights. So this is what Ezekiel's talking to. He's talking to the mountains of Israel. Right, so what we're going to do in the next few slides is just give a summary of some of the key things that Ezekiel and other prophets say to the mountains of Israel. And we're not going to look up all the passages because I want to kind of go fairly quickly to the passages we do want to look up. So here's the first stage of the mountain prophecies that we can read about in the Bible. The first one is this, that the mountains of Israel would be desolate while the Jews were scattered in exile. Now, we know this prophecy of exile and scattering and desolation, but just for context, reminder, and maybe some of the young people may not be familiar with some of these mountain prophecies, but they are so amazing. So the first one is the mountains of Israel would be desolate while the Jews were scattered and exiled. And there's passages there that talk about that, including chapter 36, verse 4. So let's just quickly, because we're there, look at this one. Verse 3, therefore prophesy and say, thus says the Lord God, because they made you desolate, you being the mountains of Israel, and swallowed you up on every side so that you became the possession of the rest of the nations, and you were taken up by the lips of talkers and slandered by the people, right? So the mountains of Israel have been desolated, they've been slandered by all the other nations, and they've been overtaken by the nations. That's what Ezekiel says 2,600 years ago. Awesome. That's one of the first prophecies. The second kind of group of mountain prophecies is that the prophets, especially Ezekiel, are very clear that people are going to invade those mountains. Not the coastal areas. He's not concerned about all that. He's actually talking about the mountain areas. They're going to be invaded. Now, just look at what it says here in verses 2 and 3. On your own time, you might want to connect it to what happened in chapter 35, but we're not going to do that tonight. Look at verse 2. Thus saith the Lord God, because the enemy has said of you, the mountains of Israel, mountains, aha, and I'm reading from the New King James, the ancient heights have become our possession. Now, the King James Version translates that as the high places, right? The ancient high places. But there's some merit in thinking that in this context in Ezekiel, the ancient heights are referring to the whole group of the mountains of Israel. And just for record, that same word heights here is used of the high places that pagan idolatry was committed at, but it's also used in Deuteronomy and in Habakkuk of actual high places as in mountains. So it says the enemy has said, we've taken the ancient heights and they become our possession, right? They've been invaded and they've been desolated, as we read in verse 3, and demolished and people slander the mountains of Israel. So that's the second prophecy related to the mountain of Israel, or the second focus of the prophet Ezekiel. Pretty interesting, right? Think about what's going on in the mountains of Israel today and over history, and that's exactly what's happened. People have taken them, and the mountains of Israel are probably the most slandered piece of geography in national headlines ever. It's amazing. But here's the third one. The prophets also say that the mountains of Israel and its key city would be a massive source of international conflict. So Ezekiel talks about this in chapter 35 and 36, and also Zechariah 12. Let's just quickly take a peek at Zechariah 12 so we're clear on this. Zechariah 12 says this area and its key city will be an area of international conflict. Now, of course, if you're not familiar with geography, Jerusalem is right smack in the mountains of Israel and surrounded on almost every side by the mountains of Israel. If you can think, we'll show you a map later, but if you can think of the mountains of Israel like an amoeba, I'm a biology teacher too, kind of like Uncle Jim. And if you can think of Jerusalem as like a food particle, the amoeba is kind of like going around it, and we'll see that at the end of tonight. But if you look on a map, that's what's going on. Of drunkenness to all the surrounding peoples when they lay siege against Judah and Jerusalem. It will happen in that day that I will make Jerusalem, which is in the mountains of Israel, a very heavy stone for all peoples. All who would heave it away will surely be cut in pieces, though all nations of the earth are gathered against it. So this area is going to be an international conflict zone. Now, just stop for a second. Just so we know, some of this might be familiar history. Don't worry, put all that aside and just be re-excited tonight, because that's what tonight is. Simple but exciting. I took this news headline from a website a while ago because I thought it was amazing. Right? The news headline last year when things were going down was the situation in Jerusalem is boiling over. Here's how it all happened. Right? Well, you could actually take that news headline and apply it to almost any century for the last, 4,000 years. You could have this headline during the Babylonians or the Persians. You could also have that headline at the time of the Greeks with Alex the Great. But then the Ptolemies and the Seleucids took over and demolished the land and took over for a while. Then the Hasmoneans came along, the Romans came along, Persians smashed that area. The Byzantine Christians demolished the area. The Muslims came along, same thing, right? Jerusalem's about to boil over. Here's how it all happened. Well, this is the Muslim time period, same thing. Then the Crusaders came along and they're under Ayyubid Saladin recaptures that area. The Mamluks come in, the Ottomans come in, the British Mandate comes in, they chop up the whole land and divide it up, and there's all sorts of weird stuff with the Sykes-Picot Agreement and people doing crazy deals with France and Britain and Russia. And then you get to 1967 where they take it back. And then you have this present day conflict, obviously, with the West Bank. I think it is. There's Jerusalem right in the mountains of Israel. It's beautiful. It's all surrounded on the north and the south and the east, right in that area. And we know that map is showing the Palestinian and the Israeli controlled areas. And it's just chopped up like anything. It's minced, right? And we know that this is an area of conflict. And it is today in our days. Number 4, the mountain prophecies also say that Israel, as we know, we're so familiar with this, but don't let the amazingness escape us. Israel will eventually be reestablished on the mountains of Israel as one nation. Ezekiel 37 has that as its whole topic. Zechariah chapter 12, where we were, tells us that Jerusalem is going to be in her own. Look what it says at the end of verse 6, because we're still there. End of verse 6 of Zechariah 12. But Jerusalem shall be inhabited again in her own place. Jerusalem, just in case you missed it. Amazing, right? So they're going to be re-inhabited. And we're told that these mountains of Israel are where the nation of Israel is going to be made one nation. Now, for those who don't know, and maybe most of us do, but that's okay. We're watching prophecy all over again, just reliving it. In 1948, we were amazed, right? Christadelphians the world over and other Christian groups were amazed because in 1948, Israel got a huge part of their land back, except for the West Bank. Now, Christadelphians at the time and other people that understood Bible prophecy were like, this is amazing, except we still need the West Bank, because so many of the prophecies that we looked at tonight are about the mountains of Israel, and most of the mountains of Israel are where the West Bank is and where Syria is on the east side of Galilee, up near the Golan Heights. So when 1967 happened, Christadelphians and other people that understood prophecy were so fundamentally excited because we knew it had to happen. We had to get Israel with possession of the mountains of Israel, however controversial that was. Because all of these prophecies in Ezekiel and some of the other prophets could not be fully fulfilled until Israel had possession of the mountains. And that was not true in 1948. That's a critical Bible prophecy, and it's electric. And it kind of explains why my friend back home, older friend, his mom was dancing in the kitchen, right? This is now the mountains of Israel fitting into place, not just the political reestablishment of Israel, but the geography is now coming into place. Now, we're getting to where we wanted to get to now. The fifth thing that's said about these mountains is not only that Israel would grab them, but he also says very specifically, if you notice tonight, that I'm going to multiply people so that men walk on you. And those men will be Jewish people, men and women. Look at what come back to Ezekiel 36 and just see how important this is for our understanding of this prophecy. Ezekiel 36, this is emphasized really strongly. Look at verse 8. He's talking to the mountains of Israel again. A little Bible marking exercise. You might go through chapter 35 to 39 and color in all the references to the mountains of Israel, because that is what this is about. So look at what it says in verse 10. Speaking to the mountains, I will multiply men upon you, all the house of Israel, all of it. And the cities shall be inhabited and the ruins rebuilt. Now we know that's coming to pass now in part. I will multiply men upon you and beast, and they shall increase and bear young. And I will make you inhabited as in the former times, and do better for you than you were at your beginnings. Then you shall know that I am Yahweh. Right? In case we missed it, look at verse 12. Yes, I will cause men to walk on you, my people Israel. That's so emphatic, isn't it? It's amazing. Now, just for reference, it might be worth sketching in your margin that these are the elements that are needed for Ezekiel 38 to take place. Remember Ezekiel 38? Gog comes down and says, well, we're told in Ezekiel 38, he's coming to a place that's long been desolate, mountains of Israel. People are coming back, and they're coming down to take goods and livestock, right? Well, that's what Ezekiel 36 said would happen on the mountains of Israel. They'd get people and livestock, and it would start to be rejuvenated in that time. And this is what he's emphasizing in Ezekiel 36. Now, we can't escape this, because this is the backbone to part 2, right? I don't know if you knew this, but last February, the news headlines had the Jewish settlers in the West Bank have finally passed 500,000 people. 500,000 Jewish settlers on the mountains of Israel. That is in direct fulfillment of Ezekiel 36, verses 10 to 12. Now, that's not necessarily nice for the world, because that's caused all sorts of problems. In fact, the international community says it's not right. The land doesn't belong to them, and they're occupying it, and they're aggravating the whole situation. But whatever our call on that is, the reality is Jewish settlers are taking over the mountains of Israel. And that's part of the international conflict, right? Israel approves this last year over 7,000 more settlement homes in the West Bank, groups say. Now, that's an incredible thing, because Ezekiel kept saying, I'm going to make men walk on you, like they're going to be Israelitish people, Jewish people. And that's what we see happening all around us. Now, that's all amazing. But then there's another element, because Ezekiel addresses what are those people going to do on the mountains of Israel. And here's where things get even more interesting for our times. The sixth thing that the prophets say, Ezekiel included, is that the mountains will be replanted and super productive. Now, let's just be really clear, right? He's not talking about the lowland plains. as productive as those have come. It's amazing to see Israel and what they've done, right? He's not talking about the Negev, where they're planting all sorts of crazy things with their irrigation technology. He's not talking about that. What Ezekiel is interested in, and Jeremiah and Amos, he says, what I'm really going to tell you is that these mountains that have been completely denuded and wrecked. In fact, some scientists suggest over 2,000 years of history, the mountains of Israel have lost 20 inches of topsoil. 20 inches, because they've cut all the trees out, they've devastated it all, and the whole thing has become windswept, rocky, and they've just lost so much stuff over 2,000 years. But Ezekiel says that land on the mountains of Israel is going to be absolutely full of juicy, yummy stuff, especially grapes. Have a look at verse 8. But you, O mountains of Israel, you shall shoot forth your branches and yield your fruit to my people Israel. I love this phrase, for they are about to come. Think about that. Like we have way more Jewish people to see come back under the mission of Elijah and the return of Christ to his people. There's going to be a huge influx of Israelites back in that time too. But it's starting now, right? And he says, you're going to shoot forth your branches. Now, what branches? It's a little bit ambiguous, but it could be any branches. And that's the point. It's all types of branches, right? But other prophets make it clear. But I just wanted to come over to verse 33. Thus says the Lord God, Adonai Yahweh, on the day that I cleanse you from all your iniquities, which hasn't happened yet, I will also enable you to dwell in your cities, and the ruins shall be rebuilt. Now, that process is happening, but it is an ongoing process with a finality when Christ returns. The desolate land shall be tilled instead of lying desolate in the sight of all who pass by, and all those nations we listed have done that. And they will say, this land that was desolate has become like the Garden of Eden. Now, all you have to do is look on Google Earth and zoom in on Israel and realize that all of its borders are brown, but on the inside, there's green. It's crazy, and we know that, but this is the beginnings of the fulfillment of those prophecies. But there's one particular crop, one particular fruit that is really, really important to these prophecies. I want you to come back to Ezekiel 28. So let's have a look at some of these. Look what Ezekiel mentions in chapter 28, verse 25. Thus says Adonai Yahweh, when I have gathered the house of Israel from the peoples whom they are scattered, and am hallowed in them in the sight of the Gentiles, then they will dwell in their own land, which I gave to my servant Jacob, and they will dwell safely there, build houses, and plant vineyards. So specifically, they're going to plant vineyards. Yes, they're going to dwell securely, and when I execute judgments on those around them who despise them. So the thing that Ezekiel 28 points out is that they're going to plant vineyards. Now, when we come to Amos, so let's come out of Ezekiel and come to Amos chapter 9. And here's where we start to see the wine of the prophets. Amos chapter 9. This is a restoration passage that has application both now and future for Israel. But look what it says in verse 13, and this is electric if we can see this. Behold, Amos 9:13, behold, the days are coming, says Yahweh, when the plowman shall overtake the reaper, and the treader of grapes, him who sows seed. Now, you couldn't do that for the last 2,000 years in Israel, really. That amount of abundance in production has not been there until recent times, right? And it's not just the lowlands or anywhere, it's the mountains. Look what it says. The mountains shall drip sweet wine, and all the hills will flow with it. That's an extraordinary passage of the abundance of wine in the mountains. And it's like the mountains are producing and it's just all flowing down the ravines. Forget water. The wine's just filling it all up and just dripping down like crazy. And I will bring back the captives of my people Israel, and they shall build the waste cities and inhabit them. Here it is again. They will plant vineyards and drink wine from them. They shall also make gardens and eat fruit from them. And I will, now listen to what he does here. It's clever and amazing. In verse 15, he switches to talking about the people, but he's using vineyard language. I will plant them in their land, and no longer shall they be pulled up. From the land I have given them, says Yahweh your God. Now you think about it. Obviously, we know Israel is symbolized by the vineyard in amazing ways. And you can do things to vineyards that you can do to people, right? You can plant them and you can rip them up and you can transplant them. That's exactly what happened to the Jewish nation, right? But you can also crush them and extract juice from them in that sense. So all these things that can happen to vineyards is really, it's not about the vineyards in the end. It's about Israel being there, his people being planted like the vineyards. The vineyards are going to be a symbol of what will happen to the people and what's happening to the people in the nearness of Christ's return. So that's pretty extraordinary. Now, little question that you may not realize in our brotherhood, if we just think about this. When you come to Ezekiel 36 and 37, there is some differing views on those chapters in terms of what they're speaking of. So there's some brothers and sisters feel very strongly that Ezekiel 36 is only talking about after the invasion of Israel in the mountains of Israel. So some people put chapter 36 and all the restoration verses that we read about only after the invasion of Israel in Ezekiel 38. But it can't be that way, young people and brothers and sisters, because we know when we read Ezekiel 38, this is how Israel is described, right? Ezekiel 36 ultimately is talking about the fulfillment of Israel. They're going to have a new heart in verse 26. They're going to be like Eden in verse 35. But it is a process, and we can't forget that. Ezekiel 38 says, when that invasion happens, Israel is going to be brought back from the sword. We've seen that. They've been gathered from many people onto the mountains of Israel. That's leading up to Ezekiel 38. It says the mountains had long been desolate before they've been regathered. He says now they all dwell safely. They're in a land of unwalled villages before Ezekiel 38. It says the waste places have now been inhabited before Ezekiel 38 happens. And Israel must have acquired livestock, goods, and dwell in the midst of the land. And Israel must have riches enough to be worth invading. So what we have to be careful of is that there's a certain amount of restoration that portends what's coming after Ezekiel 38. Yes, Ezekiel 38 says that the land will be kind of swarmed upon like a cloud, but all of the elements, the people, the land, the cities, and the vineyards are all there, and the stage is set for the full process of renewal after when Christ returns. And we know that, right? The people that are there now, some of them will survive. Zechariah seems to suggest a huge amount of casualties. But the cities will be there. And the process of regathering the people has not been overnight either. So a key focus of the prophets in the mountain prophecies is the vineyards. And we've looked at some of these passages. Amos chapter 9. Now let's just go back and have a little think. We didn't look at Jeremiah 31, so just hold that one, but we will. Let's just talk about what happened to winemaking in Israel, because it's actually amazing, right? In 2014, I think, 2013, they found in a Canaanite palace in northern Israel, in an archaeological site, 40 ceramic jars that were 60-liter jars. And they were wine containers. And in them, this is 3,700 years ago, they found that the Canaanites were like super sophisticated with their winemaking, right? And it just shows you how important and how prevalent winemaking was. We know it from the Bible, but look at it from an archaeology site too. It says that they, in the analysis that they did, they found traces of honey, mint, cedar, tree resins, berries, and cinnamon bark. There's some people like to drink mulled wine today, which you put sticks of cinnamon in, heat it up, right? And other spices. But it seems like back then they really did that. And this is referred to, by the way, in the Bible. In Proverbs chapter 9, Lady Wisdom says of her, she's mixed her wine, right? When she invites her guests in. So this is beautiful. It's a sophisticated thing for the occasion. And they mixed all these things in. So winemaking is ancient and an important process. It's mentioned more than any other plant in the Bible. It has cultural, economic, and religious importance. and it's symbolic in an extraordinary way. You can eat it dried, you can eat it fresh, you can press it for wine, or you can press it for vinegar, all sorts of things. It was super useful. In fact, in Deuteronomy 8, when God lists the 7 species of plants that Israel will get in the promised land, the dead middle one is the vineyards. It seems to be really important. So just a bit of interesting history. Over 3,000 years, winemaking in Israel was really important. Now, people actually believe that winemaking probably started around the Black Sea in the area of Georgia today. But they think that quickly spread from there to the Mediterranean. And it actually seems that rather than Italy and some of those places where you commonly associate with wine, it actually seems that Israel and that area, the mountains of Israel in particular, were probably some of the most beautiful wines in the ancient world. So much so that people have found records of the Caesars requesting wine from Israel to be brought to them in Italy, in Rome. Now, so much so as well, and so important was this in the land of Israel, and so educated were the people in doing this process and the quality of their vineyards that in AD 70, right? In AD 70, when the Romans destroyed that land and finally kicked the Jews out, it is said that the Romans dug up quite a lot of the vineyards in Israel and transported them back to Italy. So there's some thinking today that some of the varieties that typically come from Italy, like Shiraz, may have their ancient roots actually back in Israel. And they're doing all sorts of forensic DNA analysis to figure that out. Pretty cool. Think about how old this practice is. So what we're interested in is the 2,000 years. And for 2,000 years, all sorts of agriculture, but the vineyards were completely demolished in Israel. Now, there's reasons for that. And one of the most important reasons was when the Muslims came along, growing grapes and drinking alcohol was completely and utterly forbidden. So under their rule, heaps and heaps, stacks of vineyards around the mountains of Israel were rooted up and ripped out because they weren't cared for. They were totally neglected because the people were not allowed to use it under Muslim rule. And when the Ottomans come along as well, the Ottomans ripped up all sorts of trees and bushes and hedge and anything productive. And the people sometimes were forced to rip them out, as we know, because they had to pay tax on them. So over 2,000 years, the mountains of Israel truly, so they feel like it was kind of like not really sophisticated. And the reason for that is because they didn't have the know-how to do it. And they didn't have the grape varieties to make them really good. And they were mainly making them back in the 1800s for Christian pilgrims that were coming along, and also for religious sacramental purposes for the small Jewish communities. But in the 1870s, a rabbi called Rabbi Avram Tepperberg opened a small business in the old city of Jerusalem. And he started selling some of those wines from grapes that he gathered from Arab vineyards and others. And he grabbed some of those grapes and started selling them. And interestingly, his business, the Tepperberg Winery, is still cranking out wine today in Israel. In fact, we've got a bottle from here. Now, James McCann has kindly lent these to me. I have all these at home too, and we just happened to get really excited about Prophecies in a bottle. We might have been carried away, but it's amazing. So this is a bottle from the Tepperberg Winery. This is one of the first family estates that ever got established, and it started in the old city of Jerusalem, and it's still going today, right? And it's won international awards. Tepperberg Winery from Rabbi Avram Tepperberg. Shortly after that, there was an agricultural school that started, and it was sponsored by French people over in France. And they started sending French vine cuttings over to Israel. And then we get to the year 1882. And some of you might know that 1882 is a landmark year in Israel's history. This is where you have the beginning of modern Jewish settlement on Zion, right, in 1882. Now, this place is really interesting to the history and the prophecy of winemaking in the Bible. And this is where I want us to just key in for a second, because what I'm going to tell you over the next 100 years of Israeli wine history is all the roots and the beginnings of the Bible prophecy that Amos, Ezekiel, And we'll see Jeremiah spoke about, you will be planting vineyards. Now, in 1882, the land of Israel was rubbish, as we've said. And it just happened that Baron Edmund de Rothschild, have a nice little picture of him, and notice the grapes beside him, because this is something I never, ever understood. He is the guy that got grapes going in Israel. I mean, we know him for all his money, but he's a French banker, and he basically helped support the settlement of Rishon LeZion, which means first to Zion. And what he did is he commissioned a report from over in France. He commissioned a report on how good the agricultural potential of the land was. And so they did it. And the report came back to Rothschild saying, on the coast, the land is too sandy to grow anything. And people tried to grow potatoes and it was rubbish. And plus, they say that the Jewish Zionists that have returned from Europe to escape pogroms didn't know how to work hard. And they had real trouble trying to work the land. So the coastal plains, he was told, was too sandy. And up in the hills, it was too barren and rocky. So he went to consult his expert horticulturist that worked at the Palace of Versailles. And he said, what am I going to do? I've got this report. The land of Israel is rubbish. What are we going to do to help these people back in the settlements, the Zionists? And the horticulturist was like, the only thing that I think is going to work is vineyards. So let's go for it. And that's exactly what the Rothschilds started pumping money and vine cuttings into, is the wine industry for those Jewish settlers. Interesting. It just happens at the time that the Baron was the owner of Chateau Lafite, which is one of the most famous wineries at that time in the world. When he comes to visit Palestine in 1887, he gives another boost to viticulture in Israel, and he puts a team of experts together with some of his experts back in France that worked at Chateau, whatever it was, right? At his famous winery. He gets a bunch of experts. They bring their expertise to Israel, and they bring all these French varieties like Merlot over and Cabernet Sauvignon, however you said it. I'm just trying to be fancy with French. But they brought all these French varieties. So today, you will see heaps of French varieties in Israel because they were brought over by the Rothschilds. They've only been there for 150 years. But that's how the wine industry took off. And in 1890, a large winery was built in Rishon LeZion, and it's still there today, and it's still being used as a winery. Now, here's what's really interesting. Before 1948, there were 14 wineries in Israel. Most of them pretty small, producing sweet sacramental wines and other things like that. 14 wineries in Israel, some of them using French varieties. Do you know how many wineries are in Israel today? There's 40 wineries that produce 50 tons per annum or more, and there's 250 other smaller and boutique wineries in Israel. We went from 14 wineries in 1948 to 300 wineries today. Now, this is just another one of the threads of the prophets that is an unbelievable testimony to Bible prophecy and the veracity of God's word. In 1983, a significant thing happened in Israel. The Golan Heights Winery was founded. And this was done by bringing an expert over from California, right? And he got the Golan Heights Winery going in 1983. Now, this became a massive landmark in Israel wine history, which is only modern, in a sense. Take away the 2,000 years. What happened in 1983 is it lifted the game for all the wineries in Israel, and it set a bar really, really high. And what they were doing is planting vineyards in the Golan Heights at higher elevations. So they were getting better soils, better varieties growing, and better flavors from the wine. So 1983 is a really important part where the wine industry in Israel takes a giant leap forward. They call it the wine quality revolution, 1983. But even more exciting, brothers and sisters, is what's happening in Shomron. Does anyone know what Shomron is? What region in Israel does Shomron refer to? Samaria, right? I'm going to show you why. Turn your Bible to Jeremiah 31. Look at this extraordinary prophecy. This is a prophecy of restoration, and it covers the whole span no doubt, before Ezekiel 38 and after. We're in this process of restoration now, as we know. Look what it says in verse 2. Thus says Yahweh, Jeremiah 31, the people who survived the sword found grace in the wilderness, Israel, when I went to give him rest. Yahweh has appeared of old to me, saying, yes, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Therefore, with loving kindness I have drawn you. Again, I will build you, and you shall be rebuilt, O Virgin of Israel. You shall again be adorned with your tambourines, and you shall go forth in dances with those who rejoice. Now listen to verse 5. You shall yet plant vines on the mountains of Samaria, Shomron. The planters shall eat and eat them as if they're ordinary food. Now, that verse is so extraordinary for a couple of reasons, brothers and sisters. One is that there's an assumption there that the vineyards in Samaria have been completely ripped out. And the prophet says, you will again plant those vineyards in Samaria, and you're going to plant them so much that they're going to be like the old days, because you can eat them as much as you want and have the produce of them. You will again plant vines on the mountains of Samaria. And when you go to Israel, there's multiple Rhine regions, and we're not going to talk about them all. We could, because it's just fascinating stuff, the soil and the climate and everything else. If you're into the science of winemaking and viticulture, it's fascinating stuff. But Judea and Samaria, the central mountains, are one of the key places that are giving today award-winning wines. And I want to show you in particular. So this is just a little summary map. These are the bottles that I've bought from Israel that I keep at home as like a bottled up proof of prophecy. And those red dots are where they're all from. I only have bought them from the mountains of Israel, the Golan Heights, Central Mountains, and Upper Galilee, which is up to the left of Galilee there. The ones around the bottom there are the mountains of Judea and Jerusalem that you can see, but every single one of those bottles of wine, brothers and sisters, bottles of wine from where Ezekiel, Amos, and Jeremiah said, you will again plant them after 2,000 years of them being absolutely ripped up and banished, mainly by the Muslims. That's extraordinary. Look what it says. The Judean mountains have been associated with winemaking for thousands of years, as evidenced by the abundance of ancient wine presses. You know, in the area of Samaria and Judea, they have uncovered over 300 archaeological sites of ancient wine presses. This is the area, brothers and sisters, where King David would have drank his wine from. And no doubt, this is the area where Jesus would have had his wine from. It's amazing. Nevertheless, with the Muslim, well, we won't read that because we've already talked about that. But there's Turperberg. Turperberg Winery, this bottle up here gets its wines from that area in the mountains of Israel. Here's another one. This is prophecy in a bottle, right? This bottle is from the Golan Heights. And the grapes are grown on the high elevation of that, the Golan Heights winery, which was established in 1983. Beautiful. And they're like, this is world acclaimed wine now. We're going to come back to Jeremiah 31 in a second, but I want to show you this one. This one's particularly interesting. This is this bottle here. I don't know if you noticed, but if you can see from back there, but the bottle has this weird lump on it. It's like a wax seal. And it's an old ancient Jewish coin, right? This is from Sagat Winery. It's a Cab Sav. Let me read you the back. Situated in the northern Jerusalem mountain range, in an area renowned for centuries for its superb grape growing and winemaking, Sagat Winery strives to combine the winemaking traditions of the past with the most modern technology. Now, listen to this. The coin on the front label is a replica of a coin from a period of the Great Revolt, which is 60 to 70 CE. Which was discovered while excavating the cave that would become the winery's barrel room. The inscription is of an amphora, an ancient vessel for wine storage. Now, got more detail on that. But when this winery was planted right in the mountains of Jerusalem, they were digging out this old cave they found because they're like, we're going to store our best wines here. They dig it out and they find this Jewish coin. This is what the Jewish coin is, right? On side A, it says year 2, which is the year 2 of the revolt. So I guess it would be 68. No, wait. Yeah, 68, right? With an amphora, which is an ancient wine container. On the back of it, in this little wine cave, they found the words freedom for Zion. with a vine leaf on the other side. And this is a winery right in the heart of the mountains of Israel, an area that would have grown wine for thousands of years before Israel was destroyed, right? And so is that other bottle of wine, which I have at home from Gavat Winery. Both of those are from vineyards that 25 years ago did not exist on the mountains of Israel. But if you talk to the Jewish people today in those vineyards, they believe they are fulfilling Jeremiah 31 verse 5, and they are bringing it to pass. So it's a fascinating story that Jeremiah and the prophets, what they said about these vineyards, brothers and sisters and young people, is actually happening right now. And it's a testimony to the God of Israel, his promise of restoration. And I'm just going to switch forward and to what's happening in that land now. Now, just as we finish, just have a look at the symbol for Israel Ministry of Tourism, right? It's the spies coming out of the land of Canaan with the grapes on their stick. And this is a focus for Israel. And it's becoming more and more of a focus where they realize that their wines, including these ones here, which weren't around 30 years ago, are now being internationally recognized by people all over the world. And these are the wines of Israel. However, the last one I want to just show you is this one here. It's written in Hebrew at the top, but this is Batuni. And probably, has anyone heard of Batuni wine here? We've heard of Merlot and Cab Sav. Probably no one's heard of Batuni except for James and me, right? So the interesting thing about this, right, is Batuni is a type of grape that they didn't even know existed. What's happening in Israel right now, especially in the last 10 or 15 years, is that there's a group of scientists, and these are the scientists I described at the beginning of the evening. They have gone through every nook and cranny of Israel, and their goal, their sole goal, is to find wild grapes that are ancient and indigenous to Israel. And there are now multiple wineries including Recanati Winery in Israel, that are growing grapes that they found, one of those 82 varieties that they came to find, and they analyzed from genetic studies and everything else. They are growing those grapes and selling the wine. And that bottle, this bottle of wine, represents something that has not happened for 2,000 years. This is made of purely, not French grapes, not Mediterranean grapes. This is made of grapes that are indigenous and ancient to Israel, and they've been resurrected in our time. This is a grape variety that almost certainly would have been drank in the soils it grew on by people in Bible times. This is an ancient variety of grape, and it's been resurrected from the land of Israel, and the people of Israel are putting every effort into developing their signature wines that were around a long time ago. Now, with all that in mind, and the excitement of what's happening in Israel right now with the wine industry for the sake of the prophets, we know that these mountains will be invaded again, Ezekiel 38. We also know that Christ will intervene on those mountains. So we have seen, and this is for young people, but for all of us, all of these mountain prophecies have come to pass, including the vineyards. And not only the vineyards, but including mountain vineyards on the mountains of Israel. And not only on the mountains of Israel, we have fulfillment of a prophecy that said the mountains of Samaria will be planted again with vineyards. And they'll be so common that people will have them as like their common food. And that is exactly what's happened now. And that was not true 20 years ago. Not true 20 years ago. But here's the point, and here's the take-home message tonight. If all these things are true, the first 6 prophecies to the mountains of Israel, and we see tonight the evidence that things are lined up for Ezekiel 38, whether that takes place now or later, it doesn't matter. Everything's in place. And we surely believe number 8 is going to take place too. But there's one other mountain prophecy that we can never forget. Do you know, speaking about what's going on in the news right now with attacks on Iran, on Israel, and Russia sending in one of its frigates with 200 drones and supersonic missiles into the Mediterranean Sea, which is unprecedented and amazing. We as Christadelphians, and even maybe in your own quiet time, might feel the uncertainty of like, wait, now we know where it's going, but you can still feel, where is this world going? We know Christ will return, but when? We pray it will be soon. But here is a promise that is associated with all of the mountain prophecies. And I want you to turn to Psalm 125. This is beautiful. If they went into captivity, if they became desolate, if the mountains were taken by enemies, like the prophet said, and if the mountains would be retaken by Israel, which they have, and if the mountains would see Jewish people settle again on them, which is happening, and if the mountains, as the prophet said, would see a resurgence in vineyards, then surely, brothers and sisters and young people, you can trust this. And here's our final mountain prophecy. Those who trust in Yahweh are like Mount Zion, which cannot be moved, but abides forever. And as the mountains surround Jerusalem, kind of like that amoeba, you can imagine, it's like this big hug around Jerusalem. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so Yahweh surrounds his people from this time forth and forevermore. And young people, tonight, take that mountain prophecy and realize that God has made that promise and he does not renege on his promises. And we've seen amazing evidence of that tonight in the vineyards in the mountains of Israel.